I spilled wine on a billionaire. Turns out he runs the underworld. Before we dive into the story, tell me where in the world you're watching from, and if this story steals your heart, please hit subscribe. The weight of the crystal glass was the only thing anchoring Jocelyn to the polished marble floor of the grand atrium. A precarious tether that snapped the moment the heel of her shoe caught on a stray piece of decorative lace that had come loose from a nearby floral arrangement. Time seemed to liquefy, stretching into a nightmare of slow motion as the deep crimson Cabernet surged over the rim of the glass, a miniature tidal wave of fermented regret that found its home on the pristine, white silk shirt of the man standing directly before her. He did not flinch, he did not gasp, and he certainly did not move away to save his clothing from the ruinous stain. Instead, he stood like an ancient monument of stone, watching the red liquid spread across his chest with a detachment that was far more terrifying than any sudden outburst of rage. This was Theo DeMakis, a man whose name was whispered in the boardrooms of the world's most powerful corporations and spoken with a different kind of reverence in the dark corners of the city where the law did not reach. Jocelyn felt the air leave her lungs, her warm brown skin turning a shade of ashen gray as she realized she had just humiliated the single most dangerous man in the tri-state area. Her medium-length curls, usually so carefully contained, seemed to spring loose from their ties in sympathy with her panic, framing a face that was etched with the absolute certainty that her career, and perhaps her life, had just reached an abrupt and messy conclusion. The silence that followed the spill was more deafening than the orchestral swell of the violins echoing through the vaulted ceiling of the atrium, creating a vacuum in the room where only the two of them existed. Jocelyn reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers hovering inches from Theo's chest, as if she could somehow gather the spilled liquid back into the glass through sheer force of will, or perhaps apologize through touch alone. But she stopped herself before she made contact with the damp fabric. She could feel the heat radiating from him, a controlled furnace of energy that made her pulse thunder in her ears, and when she finally gathered the courage to look up, she met eyes that were the color of a winter sea before a storm. Theo DeMakis did not look like a man who had just had a $3,000 bespoke suit ruined. He looked like a predator that had just found a particularly interesting piece of prey wandering into his territory. His jaw, sharp enough to cut glass and perpetually set in a hard line, remained motionless, and his dark hair was so perfectly groomed it looked like it had been carved from obsidian by a master sculptor. He did not speak for a long moment, allowing the humiliation to settle over her like a heavy, suffocating shroud, and when his security detail began to close in with their hands reaching toward their concealed holsters, he raised a single, leather-gloved hand to halt them. It was a gesture of absolute power, a silent command that was obeyed instantly without a single word of protest, and in that moment, Jocelyn understood that she was not just dealing with a billionaire, she was dealing with a king of the shadows. The gala was supposed to be her redemption, the one event that would finally secure her position at the elite firm and allow her to pay off the crushing weight of her younger brother's gambling mistakes, which had spiraled out of control while she was working 60-hour weeks to keep them afloat. Instead, she was standing in the center of the room with the entire social elite of the city watching her fall apart, while the most powerful man in the room looked down at her. When Theo finally spoke, his voice was a low, resonant baritone that vibrated in the very marrow of her bones, asking her quite simply why she was shaking so much if it was only a little bit of wine. Jocelyn opened her mouth to apologize, her voice small and brittle, but the words died in her throat as her phone buzzed violently in her clutch bag. It was a rhythmic, insistent sound, the digital ghost of a lone shark named Silas who did not care about charity galas, expensive suits, or the dignity of a struggling woman. In a moment of sheer, unadulterated desperation, Jocelyn looked at Theo and told him that she was fine, that she was just overwhelmed by the honor of meeting him, a lie so transparent it felt like a physical weight in the air between them. Theo's eyes narrowed, his steel gray gaze dropping to the bag she was clutching as if it were a ticking bomb, and he reached out, his large hand closing over hers with a grip that was both firm and surprisingly warm. He did not ask for permission as he removed the phone from her bag, his thumb swiping across the screen to reveal the latest message from Silas that demanded payment by midnight or warned that her brother would never come home again. The air in the room seemed to turn to ice as Theo read the text, his expression shifting from detached amusement to something much darker and more focused. He did not look at the phone for long before handing it back to her, but the dynamic of the encounter had shifted entirely from a clumsy accident to a business transaction of the highest stakes. He was not looking at a clumsy event coordinator anymore. He was looking at a problem that required a decisive solution, and Jocelyn, desperate to protect her brother from the monster who had sent that text, blurted out that it was her debt, a lie born of a sister's fierce and protective love. She told him she had a plan to pay it, that she was expecting a promotion that would cover the balance, knowing full well that she was currently one step away from being fired for the very mess she had just made on his chest. Theo watched her, his gaze tracing the lines of her face, the intelligence in her expressive blue eyes, and the way she squared her shoulders despite the fact that her knees were knocking together under her professional skirt. He saw through the lie instantly, his years of navigating the treacherous waters of the global underworld having given him a sixth sense for deception, but he did not call her on it in front of the watching crowd. Instead, he leaned in closer, the scent of expensive sandalwood and something metallic and dangerous clinging to him, and told her that he did not like it when people made messes in his city, whether it was spilled wine or unpaid debts that attracted the attention of low-life thugs. He did not give her a choice about what came next as he turned to his head of security, a man named Elias with a scarred face and the eyes of a shark, and gave a brief, sharp nod. Theo began to lead her toward the exit, his hand remaining firmly on the small of her back as if to anchor her to his side. And Jocelyn found herself moving with him because the alternative of staying behind and facing Silas alone was far more terrifying than the mystery of Theo Demakis. They bypassed the valet, stepping into the back of a black sedan that looked more like an armored transport than a luxury vehicle, with glass so thick it distorted the light of the street lamps. The interior was a cavern of black leather and tinted glass, a private world where the laws of the street did not apply and where Theo's word was the only legislation that mattered. As the car pulled away from the curb and began to cruise through the neon-lit streets, Theo remained silent for several minutes, staring out the window at the passing city as if he were counting every brick and light post he owned. Jocelyn sat as far away from him as the wide seat would allow, her mind racing through 1,000 different scenarios, none of which ended with her getting out of this car without a permanent change to her life. She tried to tell him that he did not have to do this, that she could handle Silas herself, but Theo finally turned to her, his gray eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp intensity that silenced her instantly. He told her that Silas was a gnat that needed to be swatted for bothering his guests, and since she had chosen to stain his shirt with her clumsiness, he was choosing to make her his responsibility until the account was settled in a way that satisfied his sense of order. By the time they arrived at his penthouse, a soaring glass and steel fortress that overlooked the heart of the city from 50 stories up, Jocelyn was vibrating with a mixture of terror and an inexplicable, traitorous excitement. She had spent her entire life being the responsible one, the one who cleaned up the messes and kept her brother's world from falling apart, and there was something intoxicating about being under the protection of a man who moved through the world with such absolute, unwavering certainty. Theo did not take her to a guest room or a staff area. He took her directly to his private study, a room filled with leather-bound books, original oil paintings, and the low hum of high-end servers. He sat behind a desk made of ancient, dark oak that looked as though it could withstand a direct hit from a tank, and he made a single phone call that lasted less than 60 seconds. He did not raise his voice. He did not use overt threats. He simply told someone on the other end that the debt owed by the girl with the wine was now his property, and that if anyone approached her or her brother again, there would be no more phone calls, only consequences. He hung up and looked at Jocelyn, his expression unreadable in the dim light of the study, and told her that she was now under his protection and would remain in the penthouse until he decided otherwise. It was not an offer, it was a sentence, and as she looked at the man who had just saved her brother's life by claiming her own as collateral, she realized that the spill on his shirt was the least of the changes that were about to come to her world. The days that followed were a blur of overwhelming luxury and suffocating control that challenged every sense of independence Jocelyn had ever cultivated. Theo did not allow her to return to her apartment even to gather her belongings, claiming it was no longer secure and that his staff would handle the details of her transition. He provided her instead with a wardrobe of clothes that cost more than her entire college tuition, silk dresses, and tailored trousers that fit her perfectly, as if they had been designed with her specific curves in mind. He was a man of rigid and demanding routines, leaving the penthouse before dawn for the sleek corporate offices where he managed his legitimate holdings, only to return late at night with the scent of wood smoke and the lingering shadows of the underworld clinging to his bespoke suits. Jocelyn found herself wandering the vast, quiet halls of the penthouse, feeling like a ghost in a palace built for a god of the modern age, her only company being the silent, efficient staff who anticipated her needs before she could even voice them. She saw Thea mostly at dinner, a formal and often tense affair served by silent waiters where the energy between them was so thick it felt like it could be carved with the silver cutlery. Thea was a demanding companion even in silence, expecting her to engage in conversation about history, global politics, and the shifting alliances of the city's elite, and he seemed genuinely surprised when she met his intellect with her own observations. He was not used to women who challenged his assertions or who looked at his vast power with a healthy dose of skepticism rather than blind, fawning adoration. And she could see the curiosity in his eyes deepening into something far more dangerous than simple interest. The temptation began in the small, quiet moments that occurred when the rest of the world seemed to fall away, such as the way his hand would linger on hers when he passed her a glass of water, or the way his gaze would soften for a fraction of a second when he thought she was not looking. Jocelyn hated how much she wanted his approval, how her heart would gallop against her ribs whenever he entered a room, but she could not deny the magnetic pull he exerted over her very soul. He was a man capable of immense violence. She knew that in the depths of her being, and yet he treated her with a delicate, almost reverent care that was more confusing than his coldness would have been. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of meetings that had left him looking more weary than she had ever seen him, he found her on the balcony, her curls windblown as she stared out at the neon lights of the city. He did not say anything at first, just stood beside her with his broad shoulders casting a long shadow over her as the sun began to dip below the horizon in a blaze of orange and purple. The silence was comfortable, a rare moment of peace in the storm of their lives, until he reached out and tucked a stray, springy curl behind her ear with a tenderness that broke her heart. His touch was like an electric current, a spark that ignited the air between them, and when she turned to face him, the distance between them vanished as if it had never existed. He did not kiss her then, he just leaned down until his forehead rested against hers, his breathing heavy and synchronized with her own racing heart, and he told her she was a beautiful complication he had not asked for but was beginning to realize he could not live without. But the peace was a fragile thing, shattered the moment Jocelyn's past decided to come knocking in the form of Marcus, a man she had spent the better part of a decade trying to forget and outrun. Marcus was a ghost from her years in a different city, a charismatic manipulator who had nearly destroyed her before she found the strength to disappear into a new life. He had found her, lured by the high-profile news of her association with the Demaki's empire, and he was not interested in a romantic reunion or an apology. He wanted money, and he was willing to use the old photos and the falsified police reports from their final, violent night together to get it. When Jocelyn found the envelope on the desk in her suite, containing images of her bruised face and documents detailing a crime she had not committed but had been framed for by his powerful family, the walls of the penthouse felt like they were closing in on her. She tried to hide it. She tried to handle it herself by making plans to meet him in secret, but Theo saw through her armor the moment he walked through the door that evening. He did not ask questions, he simply took the envelope from her shaking hands, and as he looked through the contents, his eyes turned to chips of gray ice that promised a winter without end. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with the promise of a reckoning that would leave no survivors on the other side of his wrath. Theo did not shout or throw things, he simply sat Jocelyn down on the velvet sofa and told her to tell him everything from the very beginning without leaving out a single detail. For the first time in years, she let the mask of the resilient, independent woman fall away, her voice cracking as she described the years of psychological and physical abuse, and the way Marcus had used his family's political influence to pin his own embezzlement crimes on her. She told him about the fear that had dictated her every move, the reason she wore her hair simply and dressed modestly to avoid being noticed by the monsters of the world. Theo listened with a terrifying, absolute focus, and when she was finished, he reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing the scars on her knuckles she had earned while defending herself during that final confrontation. He told her that he had his own scars, not all of them visible to the naked eye, and then he did something he had never done before. He took off his jacket and unbuttoned his shirt, revealing the map of old wounds across his back. They were the legacy of a father who believed that power was only earned through the infliction of pain, and he told her about the night he had finally ended his father's reign to protect his own future. In that moment of shared, raw vulnerability, the billionaire and the event coordinator disappeared, leaving only two broken people finding a strange, jagged comfort in each other's company. The handling of Marcus was a masterclass in the ruthless loyalty Theo felt for those he considered his own property and his own heart. He did not kill the man immediately, for that would have been too merciful an end for someone who had hurt Jocelyn. Instead, he stripped him of everything that made him feel powerful or secure in the world. Within 48 hours, Marcus's bank accounts were frozen by anonymous offshore entities. His family's business was under a dozen simultaneous federal investigations, and he found himself in a windowless room in the basement of a warehouse with Theo DeMakis standing over him. Theo did not have to touch him to break him. He simply described in vivid, agonizing detail exactly what would happen to every person Marcus had ever cared about if he ever even thought about Jocelyn's name again. When Theo returned to the penthouse that night, he did not look like a victor. He looked like a man who was weary of the blood on his hands and the darkness in his soul. He went straight to Jocelyn, pulling her into his arms and holding her as if she were the only thing keeping him grounded in a world of shadows and violence. He promised her that Marcus was gone forever, that her past was buried so deep it would never see the light of day again, but the price of that protection was becoming clearer with every passing hour. Jocelyn realized that she was no longer an independent woman making her own way in the city. She was a part of the DeMakis legacy, a target for every enemy Theo had ever made in his rise to the top of the food chain. The romance between them blossomed in the shadow of that realization, a dark and intense connection that felt like a secret religion they practiced in the quiet hours of the night when the world was asleep. They found a rhythm in the chaos, a way to be together that felt both inevitable and forbidden by the laws of normal society. Theo showed her a side of himself the world never saw, a man who loved classical music, who could quote ancient Greek poetry by heart, and who looked at her with a longing that was almost painful to witness. He offered her a promise, a vision of a future where he would slowly dismantle the more violent and illegal aspects of his empire, moving his resources into technology, green energy, and infrastructure to build a world where she could be truly safe. But the price was her absolute freedom and the constant presence of his world in hers. She could not go to the grocery store without a 3-man security detail. She could not call her brother without the line being monitored for threats. And she could not look at the morning news without wondering if the latest warehouse fire was a result of a command Theo had given while he was kissing her neck. The weight of his world was beginning to crush her. And as the rival families began to move against Theo, sensing a weakness in his newfound devotion to a woman, the danger became a physical presence that they could no longer ignore. The breaking point came during a high-stakes merger negotiation at a luxury hotel downtown, a legitimate business move that would have finalized Theo's transition into the corporate mainstream. The rival Morty family did not care about legitimate business or the progress of the city. They only cared about the power Theo was attempting to consolidate and the fact that he was distracted by his love for Jocelyn. They struck during the cocktail hour, a coordinated assault that turned the glass-walled ballroom into a killing floor in a matter of seconds. Jocelyn was separated from Theo in the initial, terrifying chaos, her blue eyes wide with horror as she watched the men who had been serving drinks pull submachine guns from beneath their silver trays. She remembered the training Theo had insisted on, the way he had taught her to find cover, stay low, and never scream, and she managed to crawl behind a heavy mahogany bar as the air filled with the scent of cordite and the sound of shattering crystal. She could hear Theo's voice, a roar of command that cut over the din of the gunfire, and she realized he was not trying to escape the room. He was coming for her through the line of fire. He moved through the room with a lethal, terrifying grace that reminded her exactly who he was, his bespoke suit ruined once again, but this time by the dust, debris, and blood of a battle he had been born and bred to win. When he finally reached her, pulling her from behind the bar into the shelter of his arms, his gray eyes were wild with a protective fury that made her heart stop in her chest. He did not say a word, just hauled her to her feet and shielded her with his own large body as they fought their way toward the service exit through a hail of bullets and broken glass. The betrayal came from within Theo's own ranks, a trusted lieutenant named Cashin who had been bought by the Mortys, and for a moment, it looked like they would not make it out of the hotel alive. Theo was hit in the arm, a glancing blow that sent a spray of crimson across the white marble of the hallway, but he did not slow down or even grimace. He forced Jocelyn into the armored car waiting in the alley, his hands steady as he checked her for injuries with a clinical focus, and it was only when the doors were locked and the vehicle was moving through the streets at high speed that he allowed himself to collapse against the leather seat. Jocelyn took his wounded arm in her hands, her fingers covered in his warm blood, and she realized in that moment of crisis that she did not care about the danger, the moral ambiguity, or the blood on his hands. She loved him with a desperation that defied all logic and self-preservation, and she would rather die by his side in his dark world than live a single day in any other. The reckoning that followed was swift, total, and terrifying in its efficiency. Thea did not wait for the Mortys to strike again or for the authorities to intervene. He spent the next 72 hours systematically dismantling their entire organization from the top down, using every resource, legal and otherwise, at his disposal. He ensured they would never be a threat to him or Jocelyn again, and he did so with a coldness that tested Jocelyn's very soul as she watched the man she loved transform into the warlord the city feared. It was a dark, bloody period that required her to stay by his side, providing the warmth, the sanity, and the humanity that he needed to keep from losing himself entirely to the monster within that sought to devour his enemies. When the dust finally settled and the city was quiet once more, Theo kept the promise he had made to her in the quiet of the penthouse. He began the long, difficult, and expensive process of delegating the underworld aspects of his business to those who would run them with a modicum of restraint and oversight, while he focused his own formidable energy on the legitimate technological empire he had built. He bought a villa in a remote and beautiful part of the Mediterranean, a place where the air was clear, the sea was an endless blue, and the only shadows were cast by the ancient olive trees. The ending was not a traditional fairy tale, for they both carried the weight of their choices and the scars of their pasts, but it was a beginning of something real and enduring. They stood together on the deck of a private boat, the lights of the city fading into the distance as they headed toward a horizon that was no longer defined by fear or the need for constant surveillance. Theo stood behind her, his strong arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder as they watched the water churn in the wake of their departure. He told her that he still owed her a suit to replace the one she had ruined, a rare and genuine joke that made her laugh for the first time in many weeks. Jocelyn turned in his arms, her expressive blue eyes reflecting the stars above and the deep, abiding love she felt for the man who had claimed her. She realized that the woman who had accidentally spilled wine on a billionaire at a charity gala was gone forever, replaced by someone who was stronger, wiser, and deeply loved by a man who had changed his entire world for her. They had both paid a heavy price for their future, a toll of blood, secrets, and the loss of innocence. But as Theo leaned down to kiss her under the vast expanse of the night sky, she knew with every fiber of her being that it was worth it. The Dark Empire was behind them, and while the world would always be a place of potential danger, she was no longer walking through it alone or in fear. She was the queen to his king, the light that guided him out of the shadows, and they had finally found a peace that was as deep and enduring as the sea that carried them toward their new life together.